The story begins not in a palace, but in the grey, respectable gloom of the Parisian middle class. François-Marie was born in 1694, the youngest of 5 children, into a household that smelled of ink, parchment, and old wax. His father, François Arouet, was a notary, a man of the law, a creature of structure, hierarchy, and absolute obedience to the crown. To the elder Arouet, life was a ledger. There were assets and liabilities, rules and precedents. Imagination was a dangerous frivolity, and poetry was a hobby for paupers who died in gutters. He looked at his youngest son, a sickly, spindly boy with eyes that burned with a frightening intelligence, and he saw a future magistrate, a man who would wear the heavy robes of the court and uphold the order of things. But the boy looked at his father and saw a prison warden. From his earliest years, the young François-Marie felt a profound, almost biological rejection of his own name. To be an Arouet was to be common. He was to be bourgeois. He was to belong to the world of clerks and accountants, a world where the soul was weighed in coins and contracts. He craved the ethereal, the noble, the scintillating world of the aristocracy, where conversation was an art form and life was a stage. This rejection was so deep that it warped his own sense of reality. As he grew, honing a razor-sharp wit that could slice through the ego of any dinner guest, he began to spin a private mythology. He whispered to confidants, and perhaps even believed it himself, that François Arouet was not his true father. He claimed he was actually the illegitimate son of a minor nobleman, a songwriter and soldier named Guérin de Rochebrune. It was a phantom lineage, a convenient fiction that allowed him to distance himself from the dull practicality of his home. If he was a bastard of the nobility, then his arrogance was justified. If he was a secret aristocrat, then his disdain for the law was not rebellion, but birthright. His education only fueled this fire. He was sent to the Collège Louis-le-Grand, a fortress of learning run by the Jesuits. The Jesuits were the intellectual elite of the Catholic world, and while they instilled in him a rigorous discipline, they also taught him the very tools he would later use to dismantle their authority. They taught him rhetoric, they taught him theatre, they taught him that words were not just vessels for information, but weapons of persuasion. In the grand halls of the college, the boy learned to debate, to perform, and to charm. He discovered that a well-placed joke could humiliate a bully, and a perfectly constructed argument could silence a teacher. He was discovering his superpower, the ability to bend reality with language. When he left the college, the conflict with his father erupted into open warfare. The elder Arouet arranged for his son to study law, to settle down, to become a useful cog in the French machine. The son refused. He declared he wanted to be a man of letters. His father, red-faced and trembling, told him that literature was a profession for those who wished to be useless to society and a burden to their families. To break the boy's spirit, he sent him away to Calm, hoping the distance from Paris would cure him of his artistic fever. But the distance only sharpened his resolve. Returning to Paris, the young poet threw himself into the city's underbelly, not the criminal underworld, but the glittering, dangerous world of the libertines. These were aristocratic freethinkers, men and women who drank deeply, loved freely, and mocked the rigid morality of the church and state. Here, in the candlelit salons where wine flowed and secrets were traded, the notary's son finally felt at home. He was charming, he was brilliant, and he was fearless. He wrote satirical verses that mocked the incompetent, the pompous, and the corrupt. But in 18th century France, wit was a dangerous commodity. The country was ruled by the regent, Philippe d'Orléans, following the death of the Sun King, Louis XIV. The atmosphere was one of decadence and paranoia. The young poet, drunk on his own cleverness, penned a scathing verse accusing the regent of scandalous, incestuous behavior. It was a rumor that everyone whispered, but no one dared to write down. When the authorities traced the poem back to the young Arouet, the hammer fell. In May of 1717, at the age of 23, he was arrested and taken to the Bastille. The Bastille was more than a prison. It was a symbol of the king's absolute power to erase a man. Its stone walls were thick enough to muffle the screams of the damned, and its shadow fell long over the psyche of Paris. For most, a stint in the Bastille was a spiritual death sentence, but for the young poet, it became a chrysalis. He was locked in a tower room, denied paper and ink. Yet his mind could not be caged. He composed epic poetry in his head, memorizing thousands of lines, reciting them to the damp stone walls until they were etched into his memory. When he finally procured writing materials, he worked with a feverish intensity. It was within these walls, stripped of his freedom, that he made the final break with his past. He decided that François-Marie Arouet would die in that cell. When he emerged 11 months later, he would carry a new name, a name of his own invention. He called himself Voltaire. The origin of the name remains a mystery. Some say it was an anagram of the Latin spelling of his surname. Others say it was a reference to a family estate, but its meaning was clear. It was a declaration of independence. He was no longer the son of the notary. He was the son of his own genius. Voltaire emerged from the Bastille not as a broken man, but as a celebrity. His tragedy Oedipe, written largely in prison, premiered to thunderous applause. He was the toast of Paris. He moved through the salons of the aristocracy with the ease of a man who belonged there, his phantom noble lineage seemingly confirmed by his success. He was wealthy, famous, and seemingly untouchable. But hubris is a patient hunter. In 1726, at the height of his Parisian glory, Voltaire attended the opera. He was holding court, dressed in the finest velvet, his wit sharp and dazzling. A voice cut through the laughter. It belonged to the Chevalier de Rohan, a scion of one of the oldest and most powerful families in France. The Chevalier, dripping with the arrogance of centuries of breeding, looked down his nose at the writer and sneered. "Monsieur de Voltaire, Monsieur Arouet, what is your name?" Exactly. It was a precise, calculated insult. It stripped away the fame and the invented identity, reminding everyone present that Voltaire was, at his core, a commoner. Voltaire, never one to let an insult pass, retorted, "Monsieur le Chevalier, my name is one I am beginning to make famous, while yours is one you are finishing." The room gasped. To insult a Rohan was to insult the foundations of France. The Chevalier left in a rage. A few days later, while dining with a duke, Voltaire was called out to the street. He expected a message. Instead, he found a gang of lackeys hired by Rohan. As the Chevalier watched from a carriage, safely behind glass, his men beat the poet with wooden cudgels. It was a brutal physical humiliation. Bruised and bloodied, Voltaire sought justice. He went to the police, to his friends at court, to the very aristocrats who had laughed at his jokes and applauded his plays. He found all doors closed. The world he thought he had conquered revealed its true face. To the nobility he was an amusing pet, a clever monkey who had forgotten his place. No one would side with a poet against a Rohan. The law was not for people like him. Desperate and furious, Voltaire began to take fencing lessons. He bought a sword. He intended to challenge Rohan to a duel, to wash the shame away with blood. But the Rohan family caught wind of his plans. They had no intention of letting a commoner fight a nobleman. They simply pulled a lever of power, and once again a letter with the royal seal was issued. Voltaire was arrested and thrown back into the Bastille. This second imprisonment was different. It broke the illusion of the noble bastard. He realized that in France no amount of genius could overcome the accident of birth. He was trapped in a system that would always view him as Arouet the notary's son. He was given a choice: remain in prison indefinitely or leave France. He chose exile. He chose to cross the Channel to the mist-shrouded island of Great Britain. In 1726, England was a world away from France, separated by far more than a strip of ocean. While France was ossified in the rigid hierarchies of Catholicism and absolute monarchy, England was in the throes of a quiet revolution. It was a land of merchants, parliamentarians, and philosophers. It was a place where the air tasted different, sharper, colder, but freer. Voltaire arrived in London speaking almost no English, a refugee from his own success. The culture shock was immediate and profound. He saw a society where commerce was respected, where a merchant could walk with his head high, and where religious diversity was tolerated, if not embraced. He saw a country where the king's power was limited by law, a concept that seemed almost alien to a subject of Louis XV. But the moment that truly shattered his worldview, the moment that reconstructed his soul, came when he witnessed a funeral. It was the funeral of Isaac Newton. In France, great thinkers were often buried in secret or in shame, especially if they had crossed the church. Descartes had died in exile. Others were silenced. But here, in London, Voltaire watched in awe as the entire nation stopped to mourn a mathematician. Newton was not a duke. He was not a general. He was not a bishop. He was a man of science, a man who had unravelled the secrets of light and gravity. And yet, he was laid to rest in Westminster Abbey, carried by nobility, honoured like a king. Voltaire stood in the crowd, watching the procession, and felt the tectonic plates of his mind shift. Here was a society that valued the aristocracy of the mind over the aristocracy of blood. Here a man like him could be a giant. He immersed himself in the English language, devouring the works of Newton and the philosopher John Locke. He learned about empiricism, the idea that knowledge comes from experience and observation, not from ancient dogmas or divine revelation. He saw how English law protected the individual from the whims of the powerful. The phantom father of his youth, the rigid bourgeois notary, began to fade, replaced by new spiritual fathers, Locke and Newton. He realized that his true heritage was not in a fabricated noble bloodline, but in the lineage of reason. He spent nearly 3 years in England, filling notebooks with observations, contrasting the liberty of London with the tyranny of Paris. He was no longer just a poet or a playwright. He was becoming a philosopher. He began to draft a series of letters, later known as the philosophical letters, which would act as a mirror held up to the French face, showing them their own ugliness by praising the English beauty. He knew that returning to France with these ideas would be dangerous. He was importing a revolution of the mind, carrying the infectious spore of liberty back to a sealed room. When he finally boarded the ship to return to France in 1729, he was 35 years old. The boy who had hated his name was gone. The dandy who sought the approval of dukes was dead, beaten to death in a Paris street. The man who stood on the deck, watching the French coast rise from the grey water, was something entirely new. He was armed with a dangerous new weapon, a philosophy that could dismantle kings. But he also knew that philosophy alone does not fill a stomach or bribe a guard. He had learned the hard way that in a corrupt world, a man needs armour, and the strongest armour in the world was gold. Voltaire had a plan. He was done being a victim of the state. He would ensure that he would never again be at the mercy of a patron or a prince. As the ship cut through the waves, moving him closer to his destiny, his mind turned from philosophy to mathematics and to a specific, unnoticed flaw in the French government's lottery system. He was about to pull off one of the greatest heists in history, not with a pistol, but with a pen. The cliffs of France drew nearer, looming white and silent. He was returning to the lion's den, but this time he was not a lamb. He was a hunter, patient and cold, ready to carve his name into the bedrock of history, deep enough that no father, no king, and no time could ever erase it. The wind shifted, filling the sails, pushing him inexorably toward the shore where his true work and his greatest gambles awaited. The Paris that greeted François-Marie Arouet, now firmly answering to the name Voltaire, was a city of grey stone and glittering ambition, a labyrinth of narrow streets where the grandeur of the monarchy clashed with the desperate hunger of the populace. It was the year 1729, and the air hung heavy with the scent of wood smoke and the unwashed density of urban life. He stepped onto the cobblestones, not as the reckless poet who had been exiled, but as a man possessed by a new, colder kind of clarity. He had spent his time in England, drinking from the cup of liberty, observing a land where merchants were respected and Newton was buried like a king. He returned to France with a dangerous idea that a man's worth should be determined by his mind, not his bloodline. But he also carried a more practical, cynical realization. Independence, true philosophical independence, required a fortress, and the only stones strong enough to build that fortress were made of gold. The opportunity for this fortress arrived not in a flash of poetic inspiration, but in the dry, dusty columns of a government decree. The French crown, perpetually mismanaged and drowning in debt, had launched a lottery. It was intended to encourage citizens to buy government bonds, a desperate attempt to solvent the treasury. The scheme was complex, a bureaucratic tangle designed by men who understood hierarchy better than they understood mathematics. Voltaire was at a dinner party, the kind of gathering where the wine was watered down, but the conversation was sharp, when he met Charles-Marie de la Condamine. La Condamine was a mathematician, a man whose mind saw the world in geometric certainties. Over the low murmur of the salon, the two men began to speak of the lottery. La Condamine had noticed something, a crack in the state's armor. The government had miscalculated. They had set the prize money based on the assumption of ticket sales, but they had failed to account for the bond devaluation. If a person bought the bonds at their current depressed value, they could purchase lottery tickets for a fraction of the intended cost. The math was inescapable. If a syndicate bought every single ticket in the specific bond batches, the cost of the tickets would be significantly lower than the guaranteed payout of the jackpot. It was not a gamble. It was a certainty. It was an extraction of wealth from the careless state to the careful thinker. Voltaire did not hesitate. The memory of his father's lectures on the futility of poetry, the memory of the cold stone of the Bastille, all urged him forward. He became the financier and the organizer. He and La Condamine formed a syndicate, a secret society of investors dedicated to the singular purpose of harvesting the government's error. Night after night they worked. The process was not glamorous. It was a grind of ink and paper. They had to acquire thousands of tickets. To avoid suspicion, Voltaire realized they could not submit the tickets under a single name. He invented personas, dozens of them. He sat by the candlelight, his hand cramping, signing ticket after ticket with sardonic pseudonyms, mocking the very government he was fleecing. He signed some as good for nothing, others as long live the king, and some with obscure Latin phrases that only a Jesuit-trained scholar would recognize as jests. When the draw date arrived, the result was precisely as the equations had predicted. The syndicate won. They won everything. The jackpot, the secondary prizes, the monthly payouts, it all flowed into their coffers. The Minister of Finance, confused by the colossal loss, eventually realized the loophole, but it was too late. The tickets were valid. The law was the law. Voltaire walked away from the scheme with 500,000 livres, a sum that, when invested with the same shrewdness he applied to the lottery, would grow into one of the largest private fortunes in Europe. He was now rich. But as he sat in his new opulent quarters, counting the notes that ensured he would never again have to bow to a patron, his mind drifted back to the dark origin of his hunger. He called it the lesson of the stick. It was a memory that had burned itself into the tender flesh of his ego years before, a wound that no amount of gold could fully heal, but which the gold could protect from ever happening again. He remembered standing outside the opera, young and sharp-tongued, when the Chevalier de Rohan, a haughty nobleman with a distinguished name but a vacuous intellect, had sneered at him. Rohan had mocked Voltaire's change of name, asking, "Who is this young man who talks so loud?" Voltaire had replied, "My lord, I am the first of my name. You are the last of yours." It was a perfect riposte, the kind of verbal victory that wins arguments in a just world. But France was not a just world. A few days later, while dining at the Duc de Sully's house, Voltaire was called to the street. Thinking he was being summoned for a message, he stepped out into the cool night air. There, waiting in the shadows, were the Chevalier's lackeys. They seized him. They did not duel him. A nobleman does not duel a commoner. They beat him. They beat him with birch sticks, striking him again and again while the chevalier sat safely inside a carriage, shouting instructions to spare the head, for it may yet be good for something. The physical pain had faded within weeks, but the metaphysical bruise had metastasized. Voltaire had rushed back inside the Duke's house, dishevelled and bleeding, demanding justice, demanding that the Duke, his friend, his host, support him in challenging Rohan. But the Duke had turned his back. The Duke was a peer of the realm. He would not side with a poet against a chevalier, regardless of the brutality. That was the lesson of the stick. In that moment, Voltaire learned that wit, genius, and truth were defenseless against the brute force of hereditary power. He learned that without a shield, the intellectual is merely entertainment for the powerful, to be broken when he becomes inconvenient. The lottery money was his answer to the stick. He had transmuted the humiliation of the beating into a mountain of livres. He was now a power in his own right, a creditor to kings, a man who could finance his own plays, publish his own books, and flee across borders in his own carriages. With his armour of gold secure, Voltaire looked for a place where his mind would be celebrated, not tolerated. His eyes turned north to Prussia. For years, he had engaged in a passionate correspondence with Frederick, the Crown Prince of Prussia. Their letters were ardent, filled with mutual admiration. Frederick presented himself as the philosopher king that Plato had dreamed of, a monarch who wrote poetry, played the flute, and despised religious dogma. Voltaire saw in Frederick the ultimate student, a vessel into which he could pour the Enlightenment, shaping a ruler who would govern by reason rather than divine right. When Frederick ascended the throne as Frederick the Great, he summoned Voltaire to his court in Berlin. Voltaire went, drawn by the irresistible gravity of influence. He arrived in the Prussian capital not as a servant, but as a star. He was given the Chamberlain's key, a royal order, and a generous pension. He lived in the palaces of Potsdam and Sanssouci, surrounded by rococo splendor that defied the stark, sandy plains of Brandenburg. The early days were a symposium of two. Frederick and Voltaire would dine late into the night, the candles burning low as they dissected the nature of the soul, the folly of war, and the existence of God. They corrected each other's French verse. It was an intellectual romance, a meeting of the two most famous men in Europe. Voltaire believed he had found his sanctuary, a realm where the pen was finally mightier than the sword. But the lesson of the stick had a corollary that Voltaire had yet to learn. A king is always a king, and a genius is always a trouble. The atmosphere at Sanssouci began to curdle. Voltaire, incapable of suppressing his nature, began to chafe under the rigid discipline of the Prussian court. He found Frederick's poetry mediocre and whispered mockery about the king's French grammar to the other courtiers. He grew tired of correcting the monarch's verses, famously sighing over a stack of the king's papers. "See, the king has sent me his dirty linen to wash." Frederick, in turn, grew weary of Voltaire's avarice and his uncontrollable urge to scheme. The breaking point came, predictably, over money. Voltaire, despite his immense wealth, could not resist a speculation. He used a Jewish financier to illegally buy Saxon government bonds, violating Frederick's express laws against such trading during a delicate diplomatic standoff. When the deal went sour and resulted in a lawsuit, the secret was exposed. Frederick was furious. He felt betrayed, not just as a king, but as a friend. The philosopher he had idolized was revealed to be a petty speculator. The warmth of the summer palace turned into a glacial chill. The supper parties continued, but the laughter was brittle. It was during this period of silent hostility that Voltaire heard the phrase that would shatter his illusion of the philosopher king. He had sent a message to the king's doctor, asking for help with his perennial illnesses, hoping to elicit some sympathy from Frederick. The doctor reported back the king's response. Frederick had shrugged and said, "I shall keep him another year. One squeezes the orange and throws away the rind." The words struck Voltaire with the force of the birch sticks from years ago. The rind. That was all he was. The juice, his wit, his editing skills, his fame had been extracted, and now he was merely refused to be discarded. The romance was dead. The philosopher king was a myth. Beneath the flute playing and the poetry lay the cold, utilitarian heart of a tyrant. Voltaire knew he had to leave. He began to pack his trunks, smuggling his assets out of Prussia through networks of bankers. He asked for permission to travel to the waters of Plombières for his health. Frederick, sensing the finality, granted it with a cold smirk. On his way out of the Prussian territories, Voltaire stopped in the free city of Frankfurt. He thought he had escaped. He thought he was free to return to the wider world. But the long arm of the king was not so easily evaded. In a hotel room in Frankfurt, as Voltaire sat warming his thin hands by a fire, the door burst open. It was not a bandit, but a Prussian official, accompanied by soldiers. They placed him under house arrest. The scene that followed was a farce of bureaucratic tyranny. Frederick demanded the return of his property, specifically a privately printed book of his own poetry that Voltaire had taken with him. The king was terrified that Voltaire, now an enemy, would publish the poems, which contained satirical and often scandalous attacks on other European monarchs. For weeks, Voltaire was held prisoner in the damp hotel. He was humiliated, his luggage ransacked, his niece, who was travelling with him, terrorized. The great thinker, the millionaire, the friend of kings, was once again reduced to a body in a cage. He was forced to surrender the book, forced to sign papers, forced to wait while couriers rode back and forth to Berlin. When he was finally released, stepping out into the mud of the Frankfurt streets, Voltaire was a changed man once again. He was 59 years old. He was sickly, skeletal, and exhausted. He had learned the lesson of the stick in Paris, and he had learned the lesson of the orange peel in Potsdam. He realized then that there was no safety in the courts of others. He could not rely on the protection of a prince, for princes were fickle. He could not rely on the laws of a kingdom, for kings could override them. He needed a kingdom of his own. He travelled south, his carriage rattling through the passes of the expanding spring, moving away from the grey skies of Germany toward the neutral alpine air of the Swiss border. He needed a place that was nowhere and everywhere, a place where he could stand with one foot in France and one foot in Geneva, ready to hop across the line whenever the authorities came for him. He was done with courts. He was done with the illusion of guiding power from the inside. He would no longer try to whisper in the ear of the king. Instead, he would build a voice so loud that the king would be forced to listen, whether he wanted to or not. The carriage climbed higher, the air thinning, the great white peaks of the Alps rising like the teeth of a new world. Voltaire pulled his fur cloak tight around his shoulders. He was homeless, but he was wealthy. He was exiled, but he was famous. And in the pocket of his coat he carried a pen that was now sharpened into a weapon of war. He looked out at the passing landscape, the green valleys and the silent mountains, and he began to dream of a hamlet called Ferney. It was a swampy, forgotten patch of land, but in his mind's eye he saw it transforming. He saw factories, he saw gardens, he saw a theatre, he saw a sanctuary where the mind could finally rule without fear of the stick or the rind. The wheels turned, carrying him toward his final act, while the sun set behind the mountains, casting long purple shadows across the path ahead, pointing the way to the place where the patriarch would finally take his throne. The carriage rattled over the rocky passes of the Jura Mountains, the iron-rimmed wheels grinding against the ancient stone of the road. Inside, wrapped in furs that smelled faintly of lavender and old smoke, the man-born François-Marie Arouet closed his eyes, listening to the rhythm of the journey. It was a rhythm that had defined his existence, a perpetual motion away from the prisons of the past and toward a sanctuary of his own making. As the thin, cold air of the high altitude seeped through the carriage window, his mind drifted back, not to the courts of kings he was leaving behind, but to the very beginning, to the root of the anger and the wit that had fueled this long, strange exile. He remembered the stifling air of Paris, the scent of ink and wax in his father's study. To the world, François Arouet was a respectable official, a notary with a rigid spine and a ledger for a heart. To his son, he was the first tyrant, The father had looked at the son and seen a clerk. The son had looked in the mirror and seen a poet. There was a friction between them that no amount of obedience could smooth. The elder Arouet had viewed literature as a fatal disease, a hobby for the destitute and the dissolute, forcing the young genius into the dry, dusty halls of law school. But the young man had possessed a secret weapon, even then, a mind that refused to be caged. While his father believed he was memorizing statutes, the boy was slipping away to the salons of the libertines, drinking deep from the cup of aristocracy, sharpening his tongue on the whetstone of debate. He loathed his bourgeois roots with a psychological intensity that bordered on obsession. In the quiet dark of the carriage, the old man smiled a thin, wry smile as he recalled his greatest early invention, his own lineage. He had told anyone who would listen that he was not the son of the dour notary Arouet, but the illegitimate offspring of a nobleman, Guérin de Rochebrune. It was a lie, a magnificent self-serving myth, but it allowed him to walk among dukes and princes with the natural ease of a noble bastard, distancing himself from the ledgers and the laws of the middle class. This rebellion had been honed by the Jesuits at the Collège Louis-le-Grand. The priests, in their flowing black robes, had taught him more than Latin and theology. They had taught him theatre. They had taught him that the world was a stage, and that rhetoric was the sword by which one conquered it. He learned to argue, to project, to weave words into nets that could snare even the most agile opponent. Yet, the Jesuits could not teach him the one lesson he would have to learn in the damp darkness of a stone cell, that wit without power is a dangerous gift. The memory of the Bastille rose up like a bruise on his consciousness. He could almost feel the chill of the stone walls from 1717, the year his satirical verse accusing the regent of incest had cost him his freedom. But it was the second fall, years later, that had truly forged the steel in his soul. He remembered the opera house, the bright lights, and the sneering face of the Chevalier de Rohan. The nobleman had looked down his nose at the poet and asked, "What is your name, finally?" "Arouet." "Voltaire?" And Voltaire, young and arrogant, had replied, "I am the first of my name, while you are the last of yours." It was a perfect line, a devastating riposte. In a just world, it would have won the day. But France was not a just world. It was a world of bloodlines and brutality. The Rohan family did not duel with poets, they crushed them. A few days later, Voltaire was called out from a dinner, only to be beaten by Rohan's lackeys while the Chevalier watched from a carriage, instructing them to spare the head, for it may yet yield something good. The humiliation burned hotter than the physical pain. When he tried to seek justice, to challenge the nobleman to a duel, he was not given a sword, he was given a warrant. The Bastille swallowed him again. It was in that silence, in the shadow of the great fortress, that the poet died and the philosopher was born. He realized that in France the law was a spiderweb that caught the small flies but let the hornets tear through. He chose exile over imprisonment, fleeing across the Channel to the grey, fog-choked island of Britain. The carriage jolted, pulling him from the memory of the cell to the memory of the awakening. England. It had been a revelation. He recalled standing in the crowd at Westminster Abbey, watching the state funeral of Isaac Newton. The air had been thick with reverence. Dukes and earls carried the pall of a scientist, a man of numbers and theories. In France, thinkers were buried in quiet corners. In England, they were buried like kings. He drank in the philosophy of John Locke, the physics of Newton, the strange and heady wine of religious tolerance and empiricism. He walked the streets of London, an exile with wide eyes, realizing that a society could exist where commerce and thought were honored above titles and lineage. He returned to France years later, not just with new ideas, but with a new ambition. He would not just be a writer, he would be a force. But to be a force, one needed more than ink. One needed gold. The mountains outside the window were turning a deep, bruising purple as twilight descended, mirroring the colour of the velvet coat he had worn the night he became a millionaire. It was a secret history, one absent from his plays and poems, but perhaps his greatest plot twist. He thought of Charles Marie de la Condamine, the mathematician with the feverish eyes. It was 1729. The French government, in its infinite incompetence, had launched a lottery to pay off state debts. But they had miscalculated. Le Condamine had seen the flaw in the fabric of the numbers. The jackpot was significantly higher than the cost of all the tickets combined, provided one bought them in specific bond batches. It was a heist, pure and simple, but a heist conducted with paper and quill rather than pistols. Voltaire remembered the thrill of it, the formation of the syndicate, the systematic purchasing of thousands of tickets, the quiet accumulation of winning numbers. Night after night, they signed the backs of the tickets, Voltaire often scribbling mocking slogans or pious phrases as a final jest to the treasury. When the authorities realized what had happened, it was too late. The money was his. Millions of livres. The weight of that gold had changed everything. It was his armor. It meant he could never be starved into silence. He could lend money to princes. He could buy estates. He could print his own banned books on his own secret presses. He was no longer a poet begging for patronage. He was a power independent of the state. This financial sovereignty had led him, inevitably, to the court of Frederick the Great in Prussia. The memory was fresh, sharp as the bite of the Alpine wind. He had gone to Berlin believing he had found a philosopher king, a ruler who played the flute and wrote poetry and debated metaphysics. For 3 years they had danced a complex minuet of admiration and ego. Frederick had treated him like a mentor, and Voltaire had preened in the attention. But the shine had worn off the crown. The Solomon of the North was, beneath the poetry, a tyrant with a cold heart. Voltaire, unable to resist his own nature, had engaged in a shady financial speculation involving Saxon bonds, an insider trading scheme that embarrassed the king. The relationship crumbled. The words that haunted him now, as the carriage carried him further away from Berlin, were those Frederick had whispered to a confidant. One squeezes the orange and throws away the rind. The rind. The insult sat in Voltaire's chest like a stone. He, the greatest mind of the age, reduced to a piece of garbage to be discarded once the juice of his wit had been extracted. The betrayal was total. He had fled Prussia, but not before a final, petty act of rebellion, stealing a book of Frederick's private, mocking poetry to use as leverage. It had resulted in a farcical arrest in Frankfurt, a humiliation that severed his last tie to the illusion of benevolent kingship. There were no philosopher kings. There were only tyrants, some with flutes and some with swords, but tyrants all. Now the road levelled out. The air grew slightly warmer, though still crisp with the scent of pine and snow. The carriage was entering the valley near the Swiss border. The dreaming was over. The reality was approaching. Fernie, when he finally stepped out of the carriage, his bones aching from the journey, he looked upon his new kingdom. It was, to the naked eye, a disappointment, a swampy hamlet infested with insects, inhabited by a few dozen impoverished peasants. But the exile's eyes saw what others could not. He saw the potential for a horizontal empire. He purchased the estate and set to work with a manic energy that belied his frail, stick-like body. He was an old man now, his face a map of wrinkles, his eyes shining with a perpetual feverish brightness. He became the patriarch of Fernie. He drained the swamps. He built a theatre. He invited the world to his door. And he found a new rhythm to his days, a rhythm that would sustain him until the end. He spent his life in bed. It became his throne, propped up by a mountain of pillows. Wearing a silk dressing gown and a nightcap, he would work for 18, sometimes 20 hours a day. His bedroom was a chaotic nexus of the Enlightenment. Piles of correspondence from empresses and philosophers littered the quilt. Secretaries sat by his bedside, their hands cramping as they tried to keep pace with his dictation. He was a factory of words, a one-man industry of thought, and fueling this engine was the dark, bitter nectar of his addiction, coffee. He did not sip it. He consumed it with a religious fervour, 40, 50 cups a day, a blend of coffee and chocolate that acted as the embalming fluid for his living corpse. When a concerned doctor had once warned him that coffee was a slow poison, Voltaire had merely cackled, his voice dry as parchment. "I think it must be. for I have been drinking it for 80 years, and I am not dead yet." The coffee kept the mind racing, and the isolation of Fernie gave him the perspective to see the world's madness with terrifying clarity. He turned the village into a manufacturing hub, bringing in watchmakers and silk weavers, selling Voltaire-branded watches to the very aristocrats who had once scorned him. He was a capitalist, a landlord, a playwright, and a nuisance. But the true transformation, the final pivoting of the soul, arrived not with a poem, but with a tragedy. It came in the form of a letter, a whisper of news from Toulouse. The name was Jean Calas, a Protestant merchant, an old man accused of murdering his own son to prevent him from converting to Catholicism. It was a lie, a fabrication born of religious hysteria and mob violence. The state had tortured Calas, breaking his body on the wheel, strangling him and burning the remains, all while he proclaimed his innocence. In his younger years, Voltaire might have written a witty epigram about the foolishness of zealots, but the man in the bed at Fernie, the man who had survived the Bastille, the English fog and the Prussian betrayal, felt a different fire ignite within him. The wit hardened into righteous fury. The cynicism boiled away, leaving a pure, distilled hatred for injustice. He looked at the reports spread across his bedsheets, the details of the torture, the weeping of the Calas family. He realized that his wealth, his fame, his independence, it was all for this, not to amuse kings, but to destroy monsters. He dipped his quill into the ink, not to write a tragedy for the stage, but to rewrite the verdict of history. He began to write letters, hundreds of them, to ministers, to monarchs, to lawyers, to friends. He used his fortune to hire investigators. He turned the Calas affair from a local news item into a European scandal. He became the conscience of the continent. Every letter he signed, every pamphlet he published ended with a new motto, a cryptic, violent command that baffled his enemies and rallied his followers. Éclater l'infâme. Crush the loathsome thing. Crush intolerance, crush superstition, crush the blind, crushing machinery of unjust power. The exile sat in his room in Fernie, the Alps shining white through the window, the steam rising from his 43rd cup of coffee. He was no longer the son of Arouet. He was no longer the courtier of Frederick. He was Voltaire, the watchmaker of justice, and he had finally found a war worthy of his weapon. The ink was wet on the page, and the world was about to listen. From the sanctuary of his bedroom, the scratching of his pen grew louder, filling the silence of the mountains, a sound like dry leaves skittering across stone, signaling the start of the greatest crusade the Enlightenment would ever know. To wield such a pen, however, required more than just courage or intellect. It required an armor that the young poet had once woefully lacked. It required an independence so absolute that no king could starve him, no court could bribe him, and no prison could hold him for long. The sanctuary of Fernie, with its view of the Alps and its ceaseless flow of pamphlets, was not built merely on high ideals. It was built on a foundation of stolen luck, mathematical genius, and a fortune seized from the very hands of the French state. To understand the crusader who now sat amidst the pillows and the steam of his 43rd cup of coffee, one must look back to the time when he was penniless, vulnerable, and known by a name he despised. Long before he was Voltaire, he was François-Marie Arouet, the son of a rigid, humorless lawyer in the heart of Paris. The friction between father and son was the first spark of the fire that would eventually consume the old world. His father, a man of ledgers and statutes, viewed literature as a hobby for the destitute, a frivolous waste of a good legal mind. He forced his son into law school, envisioning a life of quiet bureaucracy and dusty courtrooms. But François-Marie was born with a spirit that refused to be filed away. He spent his apprenticeship not in the law libraries, but in the hidden salons of the libertines aristocratic freethinkers who worshipped wit over dogma and pleasure over piety. It was a psychological rebellion as much as a professional one. In his mind, he rewrote his own origin story. He could not bear to be the son of a bourgeois official, so he whispered to anyone who would listen that his true father was a nobleman, the officer Guérin de Rebirth. This self-mythology, this construction of a noble bastard narrative, allowed him to sever the tether to his middle-class roots. It gave him permission to walk with the stride of a prince, even when his pockets were empty. He was shedding the skin of Arouet, preparing to emerge as something entirely new. But wit, he soon learned, was a dangerous currency in a kingdom ruled by absolute power. His sharp tongue led him into the shadowed maw of the Bastille, not once but twice. The first incarceration was a result of satirical verses mocking the regent. The second was far more personal and transformative. He had dared to trade barbs with the Chevalier de Rohan, a haughty nobleman who sneered at the poet's lack of a title. When Voltaire, sharp and unyielding, challenged the aristocrat to a duel, the Chevalier did not draw his sword. He simply snapped his fingers. His family used a lettre de cachet, a royal warrant that could imprison anyone without trial, to have the upstart thrown into the fortress. The stone walls of the Bastille were cold, damp, and silent, a crushing reminder that in France, intellect was nothing compared to bloodline. Sitting in the gloom, he realized that he could not outwit a system that owned the keys to the terrifying silence of the cell. He needed to escape. He chose exile over indefinite imprisonment, crossing the Channel to England. This banishment became his rebirth. If the Bastille was his cage, London was his open sky. Between 1726 and 1729, he wandered the foggy, frenetic streets of a city that seemed to operate on entirely different laws of physics. He immersed himself in the empiricism of John Locke and the cosmic grandeur of Isaac Newton. He stood in the crowd at Newton's funeral and watched in stunned silence as a mathematician was laid to rest with the pomp and reverence usually reserved for monarchs. In France, great thinkers were buried in unmarked graves or thrown into prison. Here they were demigods. He drank in the English air, heavy with coal smoke and liberty, and resolved to return to France not just as a poet, but as a force of nature. Yet, upon his return, the practical problem remained. He was a genius, yes, but a genius dependent on the patronage of the wealthy was merely a glorified servant. He needed a weapon that could protect him from the Rohans of the world. He needed millions. History often remembers the philosopher, but it forgets the financier. The turning point of his life, the moment that truly allowed Voltaire to become Voltaire, was not the writing of a play, but the cracking of a code. It was the great lottery heist of 1729. The French government, desperate to pay off the crushing debts incurred during the wars of the previous reign, had launched a national lottery. It was designed to encourage the public to buy government bonds, offering lottery tickets as an incentive. But the scheme had been designed by bureaucrats, not mathematicians. It was at a dinner party that Voltaire met Charles-Marie de Condamine, a brilliant, intense mathematician who had been staring at the government's numbers with a furrowed brow. Over wine and hushed conversation, Condamine explained the anomaly he had discovered. The government had miscalculated. They had set the jackpot prize significantly higher than the total cost of all the tickets, provided one bought the tickets attached to specific, cheaper bonds. It was a loop in the fabric of the state's logic. If a syndicate could buy up every available ticket for those specific bonds, the return was mathematically guaranteed. It was not gambling. It was extraction. Voltaire did not hesitate. The poet who dreamed of justice saw the poetic justice in using the government's incompetence to fund his own liberation. He became the organizer, the face, and the financier of the operation. For months they worked in secret shadows. Moving with the precision of a military campaign, they went from notary to notary, purchasing the bonds, filling out the tickets with cheeky, satirical pseudonyms. "Long live the king," or "Here's to the good idea," mocking the very treasury they were draining. The draw nights were tense, filled with the smoke of beeswax candles and the rustle of parchment. But the math held true. Month after month, the syndicate claimed the prizes. The coffers of the state bled into the pockets of the philosopher. By the time the government realized their error and shut the lottery down, Voltaire was a millionaire. He had secured an annual income of 500,000 livres. The realization settled over him like a warm, heavy cloak. He was free. He would never again have to bow to a patron he despised. He would never again have to hold his tongue for fear of hunger. This wealth was his fortress. It allowed him to lend money to dukes and princes, inverting the power dynamic that had once imprisoned him. He had bought his voice. With his fortune secured, he sought to elevate his status further, looking toward the east to the rising star of Prussia. Frederick the Great, the warrior-poet-king, had long courted Voltaire, writing him fawning letters, calling him the son of the century. Voltaire, flattered and ambitious, envisioned a partnership of the mind of philosopher-king and a king of philosophers, ruling the intellectual landscape of Europe from the marble halls of Potsdam. He travelled to Prussia in 1750, entering the court with the pomp of a visiting monarch. At first it was a paradise of conversation and chamber music. They dined at the table of Sans Souci, trading verses and critiques, two brilliant minds sharpening one another. But the shine of the marble soon grew cold. Voltaire, unable to suppress his instinct for financial maneuvering, engaged in a shady insider trading scheme involving Saxon government bonds, technically illegal in Prussia. The scandal was loud and embarrassing. Frederick was furious. The illusion of their friendship shattered, revealing the steel skeleton of absolute monarchy beneath. Frederick, in a moment of cold candor to another courtier, uttered the phrase that would haunt Voltaire for the rest of his days. "I shall need him for another year at most." One squeezes the orange and throws away the rind. The words reached Voltaire, and the betrayal cut deeper than any sword. He was not a partner. He was a piece of fruit, a decoration to be consumed and discarded. The lesson was brutal but necessary. There is no safety in the shadow of a throne, no matter how enlightened the king claims to be. He fled Prussia, a fugitive once more, his carriage rattling over the cobblestones as he raced toward the border. But the separation was messy. He had packed a volume of Frederick's private satirical poetry, Poésie, in his luggage, a dangerous leverage he intended to keep. Frederick's agents intercepted him in Frankfurt. The arrest was humiliating. The great philosopher was detained in an inn, harassed by soldiers, his luggage ransacked, the book reclaimed. He was released only after a delay that felt like a deliberate mockery. Bruised, wealthy, and homeless, he drifted. Paris was closed to him by the King of France. Prussia was closed to him by Frederick. He was a man with a continent-sized reputation and nowhere to rest his head. He needed a kingdom of his own. He found it on the border, in the ambiguous liminal space between France and Geneva. He bought the estate of Ferney. It was a swampy, neglected hamlet when he arrived, filled with poverty and silence. But Voltaire, the lottery winner, the exile, the survivor, saw it as a canvas. He poured his fortune into the soil. He drained the swamps, planted trees, and built a chateau that looked out toward the majestic indifference of the Alps. He did not just build a house, he built an economy. He invited watchmakers, Protestant refugees fleeing persecution, to settle on his land. He built them workshops and homes, transforming the quiet village into a humming industrial hub of precision and craft. He became the salesman-in-chief, writing letters to his vast network of contacts, empresses in Russia, ambassadors in Constantinople, aristocrats in London, urging them to buy the exquisite watches of Ferney. He was branding the Enlightenment, selling timepieces that ticked with the rhythm of progress. He was the innkeeper of Europe, and his home became a pilgrimage site. Yet the man at the center of this whirlwind was physically fragile, a hypochondriac who had been dying for 60 years. He spent the vast majority of his time in bed, a horizontal writer, propped up against a mountain of pillows, his nightcap askew, his eyes burning with an undimmed fire. His energy was fueled by a legendary dark addiction. The servants of Ferney spent their days ferrying porcelain cups to the master's bedside 50 times a day. It was a potent, sludgy blend of coffee and chocolate, a caffeine infusion that kept his mind racing while his body withered. When a concerned physician warned him that coffee was a slow poison, The old man smiled, his teeth stained and his skin papery. "I think it must be," he rasped, "for I have been drinking it for 80 years and I am not dead yet. The caffeine, the money, the independence, it was all preparation." He had spent decades accumulating the resources to fight a war that hadn't started yet. He had sharpened his wit in the salons, hardened his resolve in the Bastille, and filled his war chest through the lottery. He was a singular anomaly, a man of conscience with the bank account of a tyrant. Then came the trigger, the Calas affair. When the news reached him of Jean Calas, the Protestant father broken on the wheel for a murder he did not commit, something in Voltaire shifted. The cynic, the satirist, the courtier, all those masks fell away. The injustice was so stark, so medieval, so undeniably infamous that it demanded more than a witty quip. It demanded a crusade. He threw the full weight of his fortune and his fame into the machinery of the case. He hired lawyers, he printed pamphlets by the thousands, he wrote letters to every crowned head in Europe. He turned a local tragedy into a continental scandal. He was no longer just writing for the sake of art. He was writing to dismantle the executioner's scaffold. The transition was subtle but absolute. The man who had once sought to be a courtier to kings had become their judge. The silence of the Alps outside his window was the only audience he needed now. The wealth he had won from the French state was now being used to expose the French state's deepest rots. In the quiet of his room, the only sound was the scratching of the pen and the occasional clink of a coffee cup against the saucer. The shadows lengthened across the floorboards of Fernie, but the light in his mind was blindingly bright. He was writing a new world into existence, sentence by sentence, fueled by the bitter dregs of coffee and the sweet taste of vindication. He paused, the quill hovering over the paper. The ink was black, like the blood of the innocent, like the coffee in his cup, like the bars of the Bastille. He dipped the pen once more. The story was not over. The fight for Calas was winning, but the beast of intolerance had many heads. The infame was everywhere. He looked at the stack of letters waiting to be sealed. He looked at the watch ticking on his bedside table, a watch made in his own village by men he had saved. Time was the one thing he could not buy, and he knew he had little left. The urgency pressed against his chest. There were other victims, other lies, other kings to humble. He lowered the pen. The scratch resumed, faster now, a frantic, rhythmic drumming that echoed the beating of a heart refusing to stop. The legacy of the lottery, the lesson of the prison, the bitterness of the reinvented, all converged here, on this page. The horizontal giant was awake, and the world was about to tremble. As the candle flickered, casting long, dancing shadows against the velvet curtains, the atmosphere in the room shifted from reflection to anticipation. The past was a closed book, the present was a battlefield, and tomorrow a new chapter of the crusade would begin, one that would require him to leave the safety of his mountain fortress and cast his mind back into the chaotic heart of Paris, where the ultimate reckoning awaited. The heavy curtains of Fernie held back the night, but they could not hold back the ghosts that now crowded the bedside of the old philosopher. He shifted against the mountain of pillows that propped up his frail, stick-like frame, the silk of his dressing gown whispering against the sheets. To the world, he was a giant of intellect, a titan who could dismantle tyrants with a single sentence, but here, in the sanctuary of his bedroom, he was merely a man made of bone and nervous energy, fueled by the thick, dark elixir steaming in the porcelain cup on his nightstand. It was a potent blend of chocolate and coffee, a muddy, energizing sludge that he consumed with the voraciousness of a starving man. 40 cups a day! The physicians whispered in horror, predicting his heart would burst, yet here he was, 80 years old and still drinking the poison that kept his mind racing while his body decayed. He brought the cup to his lips, the warmth spreading through his chest, and with it came the memories of the fires that had forged him. The reckoning awaited in Paris, yes, but to understand why he had to go back, one had to understand the journey that had turned a notary's son into the conscience of Europe. His mind drifted back, far past the mountains of Switzerland, back to the grey cobblestone streets of Paris at the turn of the century. He had not been born Voltaire. That was a name he had carved out of the void, a shield and a spear he had crafted to survive. He was born François-Marie Arouet, the son of a rigid, humorless lawyer who viewed the world through the unyielding lens of contracts and statutes. The house of his childhood smelled of old paper, sealing wax, and the dusty expectations of the bourgeoisie. His father, a man of the law, saw poetry as a disease, a frivolous waste of time that led only to poverty and disgrace. He had demanded his son follow him into the judiciary to wear the robes and uphold the ancient grinding machinery of the French state. But the young François had felt a different rhythm in his blood. He felt the electric charge of wit, the power of a well-placed word to topple the pompous and expose the absurd. He hated the name Arouet. It tasted common on his tongue, heavy with the dull weight of the middle class. In the quiet theatre of his own mind, he rewrote his origins. He told himself, and eventually others, that he was not the son of the dour lawyer, but the illegitimate offspring of a nobleman, a dashing officer named Guérin de Rochebrune. It was a lie, a piece of self-mythology that allowed him to walk with his head higher, to detach himself from the mundane roots that sought to strangle his genius. He was a noble spirit trapped in a commoner's biography, and he spent his youth trying to escape the gravity of his birth. The Jesuits at the Collège Louis-le-Grand had taught him well. They had not just taught him Latin and theology. They had taught him the art of the blade, though his weapon was rhetoric. They taught him theatre, debate, and the architecture of an argument. He took these tools and entered the salons of Paris, not as a lawyer, but as a libertine, a shimmering moth drawn to the light of the aristocracy. He made the dukes laugh. He charmed the countesses. He believed in his youthful arrogance that his wit made him their equal. But the world of the Ancien Régime was a cruel teacher, and it had a lesson waiting for him in the shadows of the opera box. It was there that he encountered the Chevalier de Rohan, a man who possessed everything François lacked: a golden name, an ancient lineage, and the absolute protection of the crown. Rohan had sneered at him, asking if his name was Arouet or Voltaire, mocking the ambiguity of his identity, when François replied with a biting retort that while his name might be new, he honoured it, whereas Rohan was disgracing an old one. The illusion of equality shattered. Days later, outside a dining hall, the Chevalier's lackeys descended upon him. They beat him with wooden cudgels while the nobleman watched from his carriage, instructing them not to hit his head, for something clever might yet come out of it. It was a brutal, humiliating reminder of the invisible walls that caged French society. When François sought justice, demanding a duel to restore his honour, he found that the law his father worshipped did not apply to him. The Rohan family simply whispered to the king, and a lettre de cachet was issued. There was no trial, there was no defence, there was only the Bastille. The memory of the prison walls was still cold to the touch. The damp stone, the sliver of light high above, the crushing silence of the cell. It was in that stone womb that Arouet finally died, and Voltaire fully emerged. He realized then that wit without power was merely entertainment for the masters. If he wanted to speak, if he wanted to bite, he needed more than just words. He needed independence. He needed to be untouchable. Exile followed imprisonment. He was cast out of France, across the narrow grey channel to the mist-shrouded island of Great Britain. It was a journey that felt like travelling to another planet. In London he breathed air that tasted of coal smoke and freedom. He saw a society where merchants were respected, where a man could think without the permission of a priest, and where the universe was governed not by the whims of a monarch, but by the mathematical laws of Isaac Newton. He stood in the crowd at Westminster Abbey and watched as Newton, a scientist, a commoner, was buried with the pomp and ceremony usually reserved for kings. The sight shook him to his core. In France, thinkers were thrown into dungeons. Here they were interred in cathedrals. He devoured the works of John Locke, drinking in the radical idea that knowledge came from experience, from the senses, not from divine decree. He returned to France years later, carrying these dangerous English ideas, like contraband sewn into the lining of his coat. He was determined to infect his homeland with the virus of reason, but reason alone could not protect him. He needed armor, and in the 18th century the only armor that mattered was gold. The memory shifted now, moving from the damp fog of London to a dinner party in Paris. Illuminated by the warm glow of beeswax candles, he was seated next to a mathematician named Charles-Marie de la Condamine. The conversation had turned to the government's new lottery, a desperate scheme to pay off state debts. As La Condamine spoke, outlining the rules of the lottery, Voltaire's mind, sharpened by the logic of Newton and the skepticism of the streets, began to whir. He listened to the numbers, the cost of the tickets, the value of the bonds, the size of the jackpot. It was a complex equation, buried under layers of bureaucracy, but as the mathematician spoke, the floor revealed itself with crystalline clarity. The government had miscalculated. If one bought the tickets in specific, low-value batches, the cost of entering the lottery was mathematically lower than the payout of the jackpot. It was not a gamble. It was a certainty, a spark of rebellion, far more practical than poetry, ignited in his chest. They formed a syndicate, a secret alliance of investors. It was a heist conducted not with masks and pistols, but with quills and ledgers. Night after night they worked, buying up the tickets, thousands of them, filling out the forms with false names and sarcastic pseudonyms, mocking the government even as they robbed it. When the draw came, the result was inevitable. They won. And they won again. The government, realizing too late that they had been outmaneuvered by a poet and a mathematician, was furious. But the law was on the side of the syndicate. Voltaire walked away with 500,000 livres. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He was free. For the first time in his life, he did not need a patron. He did not need a pension from the king. He did not need to bow to a duke to pay for his supper. The gold was not for luxury, though he enjoyed luxury. The gold was a fortress. It was the foundation upon which he would build his empire of the mind. He had bought his voice, yet the heart is a treacherous thing, and even a wealthy philosopher craves the validation of kings. The memory turned darker now, curdling like milk left in the sun. It travelled east to the court of Frederick the Great in Prussia. It had seemed like a dream at first. Frederick, the soldier-poet, the monarch who played the flute and wrote treatises on peace, had courted Voltaire like a lover. He offered him a place at the palace of Sans-Souci, without care. It was to be a utopia of the mind, a kingdom ruled by philosophy, where the king and the thinker would dine together as equals, debating the nature of the soul while the world burned outside. Voltaire had gone. He had donned the chamberlain's key, a symbol of his office, and sat at the king's table. For a time, it was magnificent. They corrected each other's verses, they laughed at the superstitions of the church, they dreamed of a new Europe. But slowly, the veneer began to crack. Voltaire, with his irrepressible instinct for business, engaged in a shady financial speculation involving Saxon bonds, defying the king's laws. Frederick, the enlightened monarch, revealed the steel beneath the velvet. The whispers began to circulate in the marble corridors of Potsdam. The king was tired of his French guest. The king found Voltaire's ego tiresome. And then came the report, delivered by a mutual acquaintance, a sentence that would scar Voltaire more deeply than the beatings of the Rohan lackeys. Frederick had been asked why he kept the troublesome Frenchman around. The king had shrugged, his blue eyes cold and pragmatic, and replied, "One squeezes the orange and throws away the rind." The words echoed in the silence of the bedroom in Ferney, as sharp and acidic as the fruit itself. The orange rind. That was all he was to them, a piece of fruit to be consumed for its juice, his wit, his fame, his polished prose, and then discarded when the flavour was gone. He was not a friend. He was not a mentor. He was a commodity. The pain of that betrayal had been a second Bastille, a prison of the heart. He had fled Prussia, humiliated, stripping himself of the chamberlain's key, the orders, the decorations. He had learned the final bitter lesson of his life. There are no philosopher kings. Power ultimately respects only power. A king, no matter how much fruit music he plays, will always be a predator, and a subject will always be prey. He had returned to the borders of France, but not to Paris, not yet. He had settled here, in Ferney, a place that belonged to no one but him. He had taken the lesson of the orange rind and swallowed it whole. If he was to be a rind, he would be one so bitter, so tough, that no king could chew him. He used his lottery fortune to build his own kingdom. He drained the swamps, he built the factories, he invited the persecuted watchmakers, the Huguenots fleeing the very intolerance he fought, and gave them a home. He became the patriarch of Ferney. He sold their watches to the courts of Europe, writing personal letters to Catherine the Great of Russia and the ambassadors of Spain, acting as the supreme salesman for his village of outcasts. "Give me a lever and a place to stand, and I will move the world," Archimedes had said. Ferney was his place to stand. His wealth was the lever, and his pen, the scratchy, relentless pen that lay next to him on the quilt, was the force that moved it. The old man sighed, the breath rattling in his chest. The coffee was finished, the dregs settling at the bottom of the cup like the sediments of history. The orange rind had not been thrown away. It had dried, hardened, and become kindling. His eyes moved to the window, where the first hint of grey was touching the peaks of the Alps. The night of memory was fading, and the day of action was approaching. He had survived the father who wanted to silence him, the aristocrat who wanted to beat him, the prison that wanted to bury him, and the king who wanted to use him. He had outlived them all, or at least outlasted their power over him. But there was one ghost that would not fade with the morning light. It was the ghost of a man he had never met, a merchant from Toulouse named John Cala, a man broken on the wheel, his limbs shattered by the iron bar of the state, strangled by the hangman, and burned to ashall for a crime he did not commit, condemned by a court drunk on religious bigotry, the Callous affair. It was the spark that had turned the cynical satirist into the crusader. It was no longer enough to be witty, he had to be righteous. It was no longer enough to mock the darkness, he had to bring the fire. The lottery money, the Prussian humiliation, the English lessons, they were all preparation for this war. He pushed the blankets aside, his frail legs swinging over the edge of the bed. He was horizontal no longer. The pain in his joints was sharp, a reminder of his mortality. But the fire in his mind was hotter. He reached for the bell on the table to summon his secretary. There were letters to dictate. There were judges to shame. There were ministers to terrify. The orange rind was about to squeeze back. The transition from the solitary reflection of the night to the manic industry of the morning began. The room, once a tomb of memories, became a command center. The sun, cresting the mountains, did not bring peace. It brought the battlefield into focus. And as the light hit the inkwell, turning the black liquid into a mirror, Voltaire saw not his own reflection, but the faces of the accused, the tortured, and the silenced. They were waiting for him. He dipped the quill. The scratch began again. The sound was not a melody, but a march. He was writing a new ending to the story of France, one word at a time, and he would not rest until the final sentence was delivered. The journey to Paris was not a return, it was an invasion, and the weapon was ready. But to understand the sharpness of the weapon now resting in his hand, one must understand the fires in which it was tempered. This quill, this simple feather trimmed to a point, was not merely a tool of literature. It was a scepter of a kingdom he had built from nothing. For François-Marie Arouet, the boy who would become Voltaire, had learned early that in a world of absolute monarchs and rigid dogmas, the only true fortress was independence, and independence, he knew, was not granted by prayer. It was purchased with gold. The ink on the page was black, but the foundation of his power was the shimmering, silent accumulation of wealth. Decades before he sat in this room in Ferney, surrounded by the Alps, he had made a calculation that would sever the chains of patronage forever. It was a memory that often brought a thin, wry smile to his lips as he worked. He remembered the dinner in Paris, the year 1729. The air had been thick with the smoke of beeswax candles and the hushed tones of conspiracy. He had sat across from Charles Marie de la Condamine, a mathematician with eyes that dissected the world into equations. The French government, desperate to pay off its debts, had launched a national lottery. It was meant to be a salvation for the state. But La Condamine had seen a crack in the architecture of the scheme. As the mathematician whispered the flaw across the table, Voltaire listened, his mind racing faster than the candle flickering between them. The government had miscalculated. The cost of the tickets, if bought in specific bond batches, was mathematically lower than the guaranteed payout of the jackpot. It was not a gamble. It was a certainty. In the quiet shadows of Paris, they formed a syndicate. They did not buy a ticket. They bought the lottery, month after month. They cornered the market, harvesting millions of livres from the coffers of a state that could not do simple arithmetic. Voltaire did not see this as theft. He saw it as the triumph of reason over incompetence. When the government finally realized the error and cancelled the lottery, it was too late. The poet was now a millionaire. He had secured the one thing that no critic, no priest, and no king could take away: the ability to say no. This wealth was the invisible armor he wore beneath his silk dressing gown. It allowed him to transform from a court jester into a titan. It allowed him to remember the stinging humiliation of his youth without fear of repeating it. The memory of the Bastille still lived in the marrow of his bones. The damp stone walls, the smell of straw and despair. He had been thrown there not for a crime, but for a witticism, for daring to possess a sharper tongue than the Chevalier de Rohan. "Monsieur de Voltaire," the nobleman had sneered, "what is your name?" "I am the first of my name," Voltaire had replied, "while you are the last of yours." For that truth he was imprisoned, but the prison had broken the boy and forged the philosopher. It sent him into exile across the Channel, to the strange, fog-wreathed island of Britain. There, in the grey mists of London, he had seen a world turned upside down. He saw a land where a merchant was respected as much as a marquis, where the mind was taxed less than the land. He stood in the crowds at Westminster Abbey and watched with wide, unbelieving eyes as Isaac Newton, a man of science, a man of mere theories and numbers, was given a funeral fit for a sovereign. Dukes and earls carried the pall. In France, scholars were buried in potters' fields. Here, they were interred with kings. The contrast burned him. It seared a vision into his mind of what a civilization could be. He absorbed the empiricism of John Locke like a man dying of thirst. He learned that truth was not a decree from the Vatican or Versailles, but something to be observed, measured, and proven. He returned to France carrying these English ideas like contraband, hidden in the lining of his plays and poems, but the memory of the orange rind served as a secondary bitter lesson on the nature of power. He had once believed that a king could be a philosopher. He had travelled to Prussia, to the court of Frederick the Great, believing he had found a soulmate on the throne. They exchanged verses, they debated morals, they corrected each other's French. For a brief, intoxicating season, Voltaire believed he was guiding the hand that held the sceptre. But intimacy with power is a dangerous indulgence. The illusion shattered over a financial dispute, a moment of ugly reality where the poet engaged in the same sort of market manipulation that had made him rich, and the king revealed the autocrat beneath the Enlightenment veneer. The words Frederick spoke to a confidant made their way back to Voltaire, sharp as a Prussian bayonet. "We shall squeeze the orange, and then, when we have swallowed the juice, we throw away the rind." The poet was the rind, to be used for his sweetness, his wit, his fame, and then discarded when the flavour faded. The betrayal cut deeper than the Bastille. He fled Prussia, a fugitive from his own student, eventually arrested in Frankfurt, his papers ransacked, his dignity stripped. He realized then that there was no safety in the shadow of a throne. If he wanted a kingdom of justice, he would have to build it himself. And so the road led to Ferney. Here, on the edge of France, separated from the reach of the Parisian police by a mere few miles of road to the Swiss border, he created his own court. When he arrived, Ferney was a swamp, a forgotten hamlet of poverty and mud. Now, as he looked out the window, he saw a thriving town. He had drained the marshes, he had built homes, he had invited the persecuted watchmakers of Geneva, fleeing religious strictures, to set up their workshops in his village. He became the watchmaker of Ferney. It was a title he wore with more pride than any academic honour. He organized the production, turning the quiet village into a hive of industry. He used his fame, the very celebrity that kings sought to exploit, to market these watches to the crowned heads of Europe. Catherine the Great of Russia, the kings of Scandinavia, the aristocrats of Madrid, they all wore watches from Ferney. Voltaire sold them time, measured out in gold and silver cases, ticking away the moments of the old world. He was a manufacturer of commerce and ideas, but the machine that drove this industry was the man himself. A man who seemed physically incapable of the energy he expended. He was a paradox of vitality and decay. To the world he was a giant. To his household he was a hypochondriac, shriveled by age, a man who spent 18 hours a day in bed. The bed was his throne, piled high with pillows, covered in loose sheets stained with ink and snuff. This was where the revolution was scripted. He was a horizontal writer, his knees drawn up to support his writing board, a cap pulled tight over his shaved head. The room was a whirlwind of activity centered on this stillness. Secretaries stood in shifts, exhausted, quills poised, waiting for the dictation that flowed from him like a river in flood. He fueled this impossible engine with a dark, thick elixir. On the bedside table, always within reach, was a porcelain cup. It was never empty. He consumed coffee mixed with chocolate, a rich, muddy blend, at a rate that terrified his physicians. 40, perhaps 50 cups a day. It was his lifeblood. When a doctor, grave and concerned, warned him that coffee was a slow poison, Voltaire had merely cackled, his eyes bright and manic. "I think it must be," he rasped, "for I have been drinking it for 80 years, and I am not dead yet." The caffeine kept the fire burning. It kept the mind razor-sharp, even as the body withered. And it was this sharp mind that had recently found a new, terrifying purpose. For decades, Voltaire had been the witty satirist, the playwright, the historian. He had mocked the absurd, but in the twilight of his life, the mockery turned to rage. The turning point had been the Calas affair. The news had reached him in this very room. Jean Calas, a modest merchant in Toulouse, a Protestant in a fiercely Catholic land, had been accused of murdering his own son to prevent him from converting to Catholicism. It was a lie. The son had committed suicide, a sin that would have led to the desecration of the body, so the family had tried to hide it. The state, blinded by religious bigotry, saw only a heretic killing a believer. They had broken Jean Calas on the wheel. Voltaire could hear the phantom echoes of that torture in the silence of Ferney. He could feel the heavy iron bar shattering the limbs of an innocent man. He read the reports, the contradictions, the hysteria of the mob. Most men of his age would have sighed at the cruelty of the world and returned to their gardens. Voltaire did not sigh. He screamed. The wit that had delighted salons became a bludgeon. He poured his fortune, the millions won from the lottery and the watch trade, into a campaign of vindication. He hired lawyers, he wrote pamphlets, he wrote letters to every person of influence in Europe, from the Empress of Russia to the local magistrates. He made the name Calas synonymous with the rot at the heart of the French judicial system. He coined a phrase that he now scratched onto the bottom of his letters, a mantra that he whispered to the walls, a spell to banish the darkness. Écraser l'infâme. Crush the loathsome thing. Crush the intolerance, the fanaticism, the organized cruelty that masqueraded as piety. He was no longer just a writer. He was the conscience of a continent. He was the Don Quixote of the oppressed. But unlike the Knight of La Mancha, Voltaire's windmills were real giants, and he was slaying them one by one. He had forced the King of France to overturn the verdict. He had cleared the name of a dead man and saved a living family. And now, as the sun climbed higher over the Alps, illuminating the dust motes dancing in his bedroom, he knew the work was not done. The victory of Calais was just a skirmish. The war was eternal. He looked at the stack of letters waiting to be sent. They were addressed to the powerful and the powerless alike. He took a sip of the cooling coffee, the bitterness familiar and grounding. He adjusted the pillow behind his back. The aches in his joints were a constant companion, a reminder of his mortality, but they were irrelevant. His mind was unburdened. He was the watchmaker, and he had seen that the time of the old order was running out. He had set the gears in motion. The world was beginning to tick to a new rhythm, a rhythm of reason and rights. He handed the finished sheet to the waiting secretary, who took it with trembling hands. The ink was still wet. Voltaire reached for a fresh page. The scratching of the quill resumed, a sound like a match being struck in the dark. He was old. He was dying, slowly, day by day. But he had never been more dangerous. The exile was over in spirit, if not in body. His words were already travelling down the muddy roads toward Paris, carried in mailbags, hidden in coats, whispered in coffee houses. He was preparing for his final act, a return to the city that had birthed him and rejected him. He paused for a moment, looking out towards the west, towards the capital. The orange rind had not been discarded. It had taken root and grown a toxic, beautiful grove that would choke the weeds of the old regime. "Right," he commanded the secretary, his voice a dry rustle. "To the academy. We must speak of the future." The secretary dipped his pen. The room settled back into the hypnotic rhythm of creation. The master of Ferney was at work, and the foundations of the world were trembling, ever so slightly, with every stroke of his hand. The ink that stained his fingers was the same black blood that had coursed through his life for 80 years, a fluid more vital to him than the blood in his veins. As the secretary's hand moved across the parchment, capturing the dictation in a rhythmic scrawl, the old man closed his eyes, drifting on the tide of his own history. The candle flame flickered, casting long, dancing shadows against the walls of Ferney, shadows that seemed to take the shape of the ghosts he had outlived. To understand the fury that now drove his pen, one had to understand the silence from which he had emerged. He had not always been the patriarch of the Enlightenment, holding court on the Swiss border. Once he had been merely François-Marie Arouet, a name he spoke with the distaste one might reserve for a stale crust of bread. The rejection of that name was the first act of his rebellion. He remembered the stifling air of his father's house in Paris, a home ruled by the rigid, unimaginative logic of the law. His father, a notary of fierce mediocrity, had looked upon poetry as a disease, a frivolous hobby that led only to poverty and the gutter. He had demanded a lawyer for a son, a man of statutes and silence. But the boy had been born with a fire in his chest that no legal tome could extinguish. He had looked at his father and seen a stranger. In the quiet theatre of his own mind, he rewrote his origins, crafting a personal mythology where he was not the son of a bourgeois official, but the illegitimate offspring of a nobleman, a man of wit and sword. It was a lie, perhaps, but it was a lie that allowed him to breathe, a psychological severance that freed him to ascend. He had carried this defiance into the halls of the Collège Louis le Grand, where the Jesuits, in their dark robes, had taught him the very tools he would one day turn against them. They had taught him rhetoric, the art of the theatre, the precise, deadly elegance of a well-structured argument. He absorbed their lessons like a sponge, learning that words were not merely vessels for meaning, but weapons of war. He learned to debate with a smile, to lacerate with a compliment, to construct a sentence so sharp it could pierce the armour of dogma. The Jesuits had sharpened the blade, unaware that they were arming the man who would one day seek to cut the throat of their authority. But wit, he soon learned, was a dangerous shield in a world ruled by hereditary power. The memory of the Chevalier de Rohan still burned with a cold, humiliating clarity. It was a lesson in the brutal physics of the Ancien Regime. He had been young, brilliant, and celebrated in the salons of Paris, believing that his genius made him the equal of any duke. Then came the sneer at the opera, the nobleman asking who this Monsieur de Voltaire was to speak so boldly. When Voltaire retorted that he was the first of his name while Rohan was the last of his, the laughter of the crowd had been a temporary victory. The retaliation was swift and physical, a beating in the street orchestrated by the Chevalier, followed by the cold reality of the Bastille. The stone walls of the prison were a crucible. Twice he had known the damp, suffocating silence of that fortress. The first time for a satirical verse he may not have even written. The second for daring to challenge the social order. Sitting in the gloom of his cell, stripped of his audience, he realized that in France a poet could be crushed by a whisper from a courtier. The law was not a scale, it was a hammer in the hand of the powerful. It was there, in the solitude of confinement, that the frivolous poet began to die, and the philosopher began to harden. He chose exile over imprisonment, trading the stone walls of Paris for the foggy, coal-scented air of London. The crossing of the Channel was a crossing of the soul. In England he found a world turned upside down, a land where thoughts could be spoken without the shadow of the executioner looming. He walked the streets of London and saw a society where commerce and intellect held hands. He stood at the grave of Isaac Newton and wept, not just for the man, but for the realization of what France lacked. In London, a mathematician was buried with the pomp of a king, his pallbearers, dukes and earls. In Paris, a thinker was lucky to avoid a pauper's grave. He devoured the works of John Locke, drinking in the cool, clear water of empiricism. He learned that the mind was a blank slate, not a vessel of innate sin. He returned to France years later, not just as a writer, but as an importer of dangerous ideas, carrying the contraband of liberty in his mind. Yet ideas alone could not protect him. He needed armor, and in the 18th century, armor was forged of gold. The scratching of the secretary's pen seemed to echo the shuffling of lottery tickets, a sound from decades past that brought a thin, conspiratorial smile to the old man's lips. It was the greatest heist never told, a theft committed in broad daylight with nothing but arithmetic. The government, in its infinite clumsiness, had issued a lottery to pay its debts, but the mathematician Le Condamine had seen the flaw. The cost of the tickets was less than the payout of the prizes if one bought them in the correct, massive bundles. It was a loophole in reality, a tear in the fabric of state finance. Voltaire had not hesitated. He became a syndicate of one, a phantom investor. Night after night they had met, counting the bonds, calculating the odds, systematically buying the future. When the winnings poured in millions of livres, a river of gold, he was free. He was no longer a poet begging for patronage. He was a power independent of the throne. He had bought his voice. He could not be starved, he could not be bribed, and he could not be silenced. The gold was not for luxury, though he enjoyed it. The gold was for independence. It was the foundation upon which he built his fortress of words. This independence had led him to Prussia, to the court of Frederick the Great, a chapter of his life that tasted of ash and winter. He had gone seeking a philosopher king, a ruler who combined the sword with the pen. For a time in the marble halls of Sanssouci, it seemed he had found it. They had supped together, debated the nature of the soul, corrected each other's verses. But the dream was fragile. The king was a man of iron, and the philosopher was a man of vanity. The orange-rind incident remained a splinter in his memory. He had engaged in a financial maneuver, a complex speculation on Saxon bonds that technically violated the king's laws. It was a sin of greed, perhaps, but the king's reaction was a revelation of the true nature of power. Frederick had confided to a courtier that he would keep Voltaire only as long as he was useful. One squeezes the orange, the king had said, and throws away the rind. The words had travelled back to Voltaire, as whispers always did. The betrayal was absolute. He was not a friend. He was a citrus fruit, a commodity to be consumed and discarded. The illusion of the enlightened despot shattered. He fled Prussia, a chaotic, humiliating escape that involved stolen poetry books, house arrest in Frankfurt, and the final realization that he could serve no master. He would be his own king, his own court. And so Fernie, the final kingdom. He shifted his weight in the bed, the pillows propping him up like a collapsed monarch. The room was warm, smelling of the thick, rich aroma of his life's elixir. On the bedside table sat the porcelain cup, one of perhaps 40 or 50 he would drain before the sun set again. The mixture of chocolate and coffee was a thick sludge, a muddy fuel that kept the engine of his mind racing even as his body withered. Doctors had warned him for decades that the drink was a slow poison. He had laughed at them, telling them that if it were poison, it was remarkably slow, for he had been drinking it for 80 years and was still the most alive man in Europe. Here, in this border village, he had created a world. He looked out the window in his mind's eye, seeing not the swamp he had bought, but the thriving town he had built. He was the watchmaker of Fernie, a title he wore with as much pride as any literary honour. He had drained the marshes, built homes, and invited Protestant refugees, skilled artisans who had been persecuted elsewhere. He had turned the village into a factory of precision, producing watches that ticked in the pockets of kings and emperors across the continent. He marketed them himself, using his fame to sell timepieces, becoming a brand as much as a man. It was a practical enlightenment, philosophy made into gears and springs. He was proving that tolerance and industry were the parents of prosperity. But the watches were merely a pastime. The true work, the work that kept him awake through the long, agonizing nights, was the crusade. The transition had been slow, a gradual hardening of his soul. For years he had been the witty satirist, the man who mocked the absurdities of the world. But the laughter had died in his throat when he heard the name Jean Jal. The memory of the callous affair descended upon the room like a physical weight. It was the moment the orange rind became a weapon. Jean Callas, an old merchant in Toulouse, a Protestant in a city of fierce, blinding Catholicism. His son had committed suicide, a tragic, desperate act of a depressed young man. But the mob, fueled by the priests and the rumours, claimed the father had murdered the son to prevent him from converting to Catholicism. The state, in its infinite, grotesque wisdom, had believed the mob. Voltaire could see it as clearly as if he were standing in the square in Toulouse, the old man, innocent, bewildered, strapped to the wheel. The iron bar descending, breaking the limbs one by one. The agonizing, drawn-out execution of a father whose only crime was his faith. When the news reached Fernie, something in Voltaire snapped. The wit, the irony, the detachment, it all evaporated. This was not a subject for a clever poem. This was a monstrosity. He had thrown his entire being into the case. He used the fortune from the lottery, the fame from his plays, the influence of his letters. He became a detective, a lawyer, a publicist. He wrote hundreds of letters, badgering dukes, ministers, and monarchs. He deconstructed the trial records, exposing the inconsistencies, the lies, the religious hysteria. He turned the Callas family into the most famous victims in Europe. He made the judges of Toulouse tremble in their robes. It was during these dark nights, fueled by the caffeine sludge and the burning indignation of a man who sees the devil in the machinery of the state, that he found his battle cry. It appeared at the bottom of his letters, a scribbled exhortation, a command to the faithful of reason. Écraser l'infâme. Crush the loathsome thing. The loathsome thing was not God. Voltaire bowed to the great watchmaker of the universe. No, the loathsome thing was the organized fanaticism, the superstition that allowed men to torture their neighbors in the name of love. It was the clerical arrogance that claimed a monopoly on truth. It was the darkness that had killed Callas. He had crushed it. It had taken years, but he had won. The verdict was overturned. The King of France had intervened. the dead man was exonerated. It was the first time in history that public opinion, mobilized by a single intellect, had forced the state to reverse a judicial murder. The victory had changed him. He was no longer just a writer. He was a conscience. He was the old man in the bed who struck fear into the hearts of inquisitors. People travelled from across the continent just to see him, to catch a glimpse of the patriarch. They would stand at the gates of Ferney, hoping to see the frail figure in the dressing gown, the man who had declared war on the darkness. He coughed, a dry, rattling sound that shook his thin frame. The secretary paused, looking up with concern, but Voltaire waved a skeletal hand, urging him to continue. There was no time for rest. The work was not finished. The loathsome thing had many heads, and he had not crushed them all. He thought of Paris. The city was calling to him now, a siren song across the miles. He had been away for 28 years. 28 years of exile, of building his fortress on the edge of the world. But the play was reaching its final act. Irene, his latest tragedy, was to be performed at the Comédie Française. They wanted him there. The Academy, the salons, the people. They wanted to see the ghost who had haunted their century. He knew what a return meant. He was 83. The journey alone might kill him. The excitement of the capital, the crowds, the adulation, it would be a fatal embrace. But to die in Ferney, quietly, amongst his watches and his gardens? No. That was not the ending the story demanded. The story demanded a return to the source. It demanded that he walk once more through the streets where he had been beaten, where he had been imprisoned, where he had been young. The orange rind had not withered. It had dried, perhaps, but in drying it had become harder, more potent, a concentration of essence that could flavour the entire world. He looked at the pile of letters on his desk, the correspondence that connected him to Catherine in Russia, to the courts of Germany, to the scientists in London. He was the centre of a web of light, spinning strands of reason over a continent of shadows. "The next letter," he rasped, his voice finding a surprising strength, a resonance that belied the frailty of his lungs. "To the Comte d'Argine Gentil. Tell him I am coming." The secretary's pen scratched louder, a sound of acceleration. The decision had been made. The wheels of the carriage were already turning in his mind, rolling over the cobblestones of memory. He took a sip of the cold chocolate, the bitterness familiar and comforting. He was going home to die, but he would make sure that his death was as loud, as brilliant, and as troublesome as his life. The night deepened outside the window, the stars over the Swiss Alps shining with the cold indifference of the universe. But inside the room the fire was warm, and the mind of the old man was a furnace. He was tired, yes, his bones ached with the damp, but the anger was still there, the beautiful, purifying anger that had saved Calas, the anger that had built a city, the anger that had defied kings. He closed his eyes for a moment, visualizing the gates of Paris. He could hear the roar of the crowd, a sound like the ocean. They were waiting for him. The church was waiting for him. The king was waiting for him. He would not disappoint them. He would bring the storm with him. "And add a postscript," Voltaire whispered, his eyes opening, gleaming with a sudden, sharp amusement that cut through the years. "Tell them to prepare the laurel wreaths, but tell them also to prepare a bed. For I intend to do my dying in public, and I shall need a comfortable stage." The quill moved, the ink flowed, and the silence of the room was filled with the heavy, electric anticipation of a storm about to break. The exile was ending, the patriarch was rising, and the road to Paris lay open, a dark ribbon winding through the night, leading back to the heart of the beast he had spent a lifetime fighting. The carriage wheels turned, a rhythmic grinding against the stones that vibrated through the floorboards and into his brittle bones. The road to Paris was long, a winding ribbon of darkness that offered plenty of time for an old man to remember. As the countryside rolled past, obscured by the night, François-Marie Arouet drifted away, and only Voltaire remained. He had spent 80 years killing the former to perfect the latter. He remembered the stifling air of his father's house, the rigid lawyer who had tried to shackle his mind with legal statutes. He had rejected that name, Arouet, shedding it like a snakeskin. He preferred the myth he had spun for himself, that he was not the son of a bourgeois official, but the bastard child of a nobleman, a secret prince of the mind. It was a useful fiction, a shield that had allowed him to walk with his head high among dukes and kings, armed only with a wit that cut deeper than their swords. The memories shifted, darker now, the damp stone silence of the Bastille. He could still smell the mildew of the cell where he had been thrown, twice, for the crime of speaking too freely. But stone walls had not broken him, they had only sharpened him. It was there, in the gloom, that he learned the true power of words, and when the walls opened, they led him not just to freedom, but to England, a land of mist and liberty, where he watched Isaac Newton buried with the pomp of a monarch. That was the spark. In France, they buried thinkers in silence. In England, they buried them in abbeys. He had returned to France carrying the fire of Newton and Locke, determined to burn away the fog of superstition. The carriage jolted, pulling him back to the present, but his mind was lighter than air. He touched the heavy velvet of his coat. It was expensive. People often forgot that philosophy requires fuel. He smiled, thinking of the great lottery of 1729, the secret heuristic he and La Condamine had discovered. A flaw in the math of the state. He saw the stacks of tickets, the mountains of bond notes, the fortune that had poured into his pockets. He had not just outwritten the establishment, he had outcalculated them. That gold had built his fortress. It had bought him independence from the patronage of fickle princes. He thought of Frederick the Great, the philosopher king of Prussia, the bromance of the century that had soured into vinegar. He could almost hear Frederick's voice, cold and sharp, remarking that one squeezes the orange and throws away the rind. The insult still stung, but the wound had healed into a scar of wisdom. He had learned that a philosopher must be his own king. And so he had become one, the king of Ferney. He pictured his estate, the swamp he had drained and transformed into a thriving village of watchmakers and silk weavers. He saw his bed, the throne from which he ruled, propped up by a mountain of pillows, surrounded by the steam of coffee and chocolate. 40 cups a day, the doctors said it was poison. He chuckled softly in the swaying carriage. A slow poison indeed, for it had taken 80 years to kill him. It was from that bed that he had fought his greatest battles, not for territory, but for souls. He saw the face of Jean Calas, the broken man on the wheel, the victim of a fanaticism that Voltaire had sworn to crush. Écraser l'infâme, the phrase echoed in the rhythm of the horse's hooves. He had spent his fortune, his time, his very life forced to clear the name of a dead man, proving that the pen could force the sword to kneel. Now the lights of Paris appeared on the horizon, a glowing nebula against the black sky. They were waiting. The exile was over. He was returning not as a prisoner, but as a conqueror. He would die in this city, amidst the roar of the theatres and the adoration of the crowds who would crown him with laurel wreaths while he still breathed. The smile of reason would have its final bow. He closed his eyes, listening to the turning wheels, content in the knowledge that while his body would soon turn to dust, the light he had kindled would never go out. The journey was done. The story was told. Good night.